Pat Kelsey made a statement. On Wednesday afternoon, the Louisville Cardinals received a huge transfer portal commitment from James Madison star Terrence Edwards Jr. We discuss on today's episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast. Stay tuned.
You are Locked On Louisville, your daily podcast on the Louisville Cardinals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? Welcome into another episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast. I'm your host, Dalton Pence. Today's episode brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. New customers join today and you'll get $200 in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 or more wins. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. As always, want to personally thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. Just a reminder, the Locked On Louisville podcast is free on all streaming services 5 days a week, your team every day. Statement equals made. Pat Kelsey went out into the transfer portal and got a commitment from James Madison star Sunbelt Player of the Year, Terrence Edwards Jr. It is absolutely huge news for next year's team. We'll then transition into explaining why it is unlikely that the Cardinals will land Florida Atlantic star transfer Johnell Davis. And then to conclude the show, we will dive into another weekly mailbag segment. So big news on Wednesday. Well, the news started to build over the weekend when the news was announced that James Madison star guard Terrence Edwards Jr. would be visiting the Louisville program on Tuesday. Now, Louisville had a ton of severe weather in the area throughout the day on Tuesday and left many questioning, was he even going to make it to campus? To my understanding, he landed in Louisville late on Tuesday evening, spent the day on campus on Wednesday, and it didn't take long for him to make his commitment to Pat Kelsey and the Louisville Cardinals. For Kelsey, this is a statement made showing that he can utilize the NIL budget and go out into the portal and get commitments from solid players. One of the main concerns with Pat Kelsey coming from the College of Charleston, it wasn't his attitude or his work ethic, or his ability to build a program, or his energy, or his ability to connect with the players, or even build funding. One of the main concerns, and it was going to be either addressed or not addressed right away, was the ability to recruit the transfer portal. And whether or not he could contend with top programs for highly sought-after players. I think it's safe to say that Terrence Edwards Jr. was indeed a very highly sought-after player, the Sunbelt Player of the Year. Not currently ranked in any of like the top 20s that you see from like 247sports.com, but still the resume speaks for itself, what he's been able to do in his 4 seasons with the Dukes, almost 1,500 points scoring. Like I mentioned, Sunbelt Player of the Year, was instrumental in leading James Madison to its best year in program history. They won a game in the NCAA tournament before losing to Duke. And now, entering the portal, became one of the highly sought after guys. It seemed like it was down between Florida State and Louisville. Louisville got the second visit and was able to close the deal. So sort of like we talk about the connection with Jeff Brom, you can draw another parallel right there, is that if a player makes a visit to campus in the transfer portal with not a ton of time to operate, you have to get your visits squared away and sort of have an idea of a school you want to go to or a couple schools that you could see yourself going to. Scheduling a visit, conducting that visit, and having a player commit right afterwards has sort of been the Jeff Brom way to go. And if that is a tactic that is adopted by Pat Kelsey, then Louisville basketball is in good hands. Don't get me wrong. Getting a commitment from Rain Smith and James Scott, pretty solid. We mentioned that to get players into your program that know the style of play that a coach likes to utilize, understands what it's like to play for insert coach here. That's sort of very important. You can't really underestimate that. But those two guys are likely going to play roles. And again, nothing wrong with that. But I mentioned specifically you still had to go out and get big name players, guys that can be a number one, number two scoring option, number three at worst. Terrence Edwards Jr., I'm not sure if he's going to be the number one scoring option, but it would surprise me completely if he is not a top three scoring option on this team. The 6'6" guard from Atlanta, Georgia, like we mentioned a couple episodes ago, is a very respectable 3-point shooter, averaged or shot about for a game this past season, 34% from three. Only had one season in college where he shot under 30%, was 46% last season. Saw an uptick in the number of shots from behind the arc and ultimately still kept the number respectable. He's better more so from the right than the left, the statistics would suggest. Has a lower release that I mentioned. There might be a little bit of a mechanical issue, but the ability to create separation and his size being 6'6" allows him to sort of get away with that. I think with larger defenders that are more athletic, it might become a problem, but he's 85th percentile in the country in terms of isolation, very effective around the rim. I look for him to potentially be a secondary ball handler. I don't think he's a point guard. He might operate as the lead ball handler in pick and roll situations, in which I think that with a 21% assist rate in 2023-24, it shows that he has the willingness to pass the ball and be effective in doing so. But I don't see Edwards being a point guard for Louisville. He's more so, he's the type of player that when you talk about, okay, a 6'6" guy being a guard, he has that guard skill set. He has the ability to handle the ball, to be able to shoot from three, efficient around the rim. I wouldn't really go as far as saying that he operates extremely well out of the mid-range. I think it's mainly based on opportunity rather than just seeking out his spots in the mid-range. More so from three, half of his attempts, I think 46% of his shots came from around the rim. So the ability to get downhill and get towards the rim and penetrate the defense is something that he does well. And then defensively, being able to, bring in about 5 rebounds per game, averages under a steal per contest, but I think has solid hands, solid understanding of the half-court offense to where it allows him to be opportunistic in that regard. So is Terrence Edwards going to be the star that Louisville's looking for? I don't think in this transfer portal there is like the go-to star. I think that there's a good amount of very, very good players that could form a solid nucleus that would allow you to compete for an NCAA tournament berth next season. Terrence Edwards is in that group. Sun Belt Player of the Year, played for a very solid mid-major. And you look at some of his best games this year, you wonder how he's going to fare with Power 5 competition. He had 24 points in an overtime win at Michigan State in Sparty back in November. In the conference championship game, he had 19 points. In the win over Wisconsin, 14 points, 5 rebounds. He had 13 and 3 in a blowout loss to Duke, but he played pretty respectable against both teams. So I think that he is a very good player that's going to be able to see his skill set translate. Is he a ceiling raiser for Louisville? 100%. Is the work done? No, it is not. This addition is a great step in the right direction for this team next year. You got 2 role players. Maybe one is for the future and James Scott, but Rain Smith will play a role for certain. Terrence Edwards is I think, probably a penciled-in starter for next season. So 3 spots down, you have 10 to go. It's going to be interesting to see how Pat Kelsey looks to address the other needs. There have been multiple names that have been floated out there, but make no mistake about it, Pat Kelsey made a statement on Wednesday saying, hey, look, I know that we have the NIL to work with, and I've done a solid job at, rejuvenating that. But make no mistake about it, I can still close the deal. I might come from being a head coach at mid-major programs, but I spent time at Wake Forest where I recruited some of the best for a team that was number one in the country at one point. I can do it as the head man here at Louisville. Here's an example. Terrence Edwards. Now the key for Pat Kelsey is, can you do it again with the rest of the roster? And seeing how the roster plays out, I'm very interested to see who the next addition is going to be. It is a dead period starting Thursday, and I think that the dead period lifts up on April 11th, which is a week from tonight or today if you're listening to this on April 4th. So we'll see if much comes from this next week, but I imagine after next Thursday, you're going to see multiple visits scheduled. So I'm interested to see how that goes. But speaking of top names in the portal, one name has been floated around with the University of Louisville. That is Florida Atlantic guard Johnell Davis, one of the best players in the portal. Don't get your hopes up just yet, Louisville fans. Davis coming to the Derby City is fairly unlikely. And we'll explain why from a handful of different avenues here momentarily after we tell you about our friends and the title sponsor of the show, FanDuel. The sports calendar is loaded, and FanDuel is making it even more exciting to get in on the action. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 you can use to bet the tournament, MLB, NBA, NHL, and so much more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet a big win. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook. Cardinal fans, quick question for you. Are you still watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Have to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, covering your team every day. I'm going to be honest with you. Pat Kelsey has the opportunity to do one of the most hilarious things out there. Johnell Davis from Florida Atlantic has entered the portal, and many expect him and a few others to go from Boca Raton up to Ann Arbor to join their former head coach, Dusty May, who is now the head coach of the Michigan Wolverines. But Pete Nakos reported something today on Thursday that On3 Sports tweeted out, and I quote, "Michigan is the school to watch for FAU transfer Johnell Davis, but Louisville isn't going down without a fight," Pete Nakos reports. With an influx of NIL capital, Pat Kelsey is ready to take some big swings to reconstruct the roster. That is absolutely hilarious. Or let me rephrase. It offers a very hilarious hypothetical in the sense that if Louisville was able to go out and get a commitment from Johnell Davis away from Dusty May, who turned Louisville down for Michigan, it would just be, it would be like a storybook type occurrence because, you couldn't write it any funnier. That if he was able to go out and Louisville get revenge for saying, okay, you're going to take our head coach, we'll take his best player. But that ultimately, in my opinion, is very, very unlikely. Number one, the former FAU, or I guess you could say the former FAU players now, I guess these players have the opportunity to go back to Boca Raton to play for the Owls. A lot of these guys absolutely love Dusty May. I remember them saying, I don't know if it was on the radio or podcast last year, that basically that they would go wherever Dusty went. And I believe them. Dusty is a likable guy. It's pretty clear that his players like him. He's a player's coach. And it wouldn't surprise me to see Johnell Davis and multiple other Florida Atlantic transfers head up north to Michigan. Johnell is from Gary, Indiana, which I believe, if I'm not mistaken, from I know that it's sort of close to the Chicago area, but when it comes to how close it is to Ann Arbor, Michigan, I could be wrong, but I believe it's about 3 hours, right? It's not too far, but it's close enough to where it makes sense. Now, Louisville to Gary, Indiana is about another hour. It's about 4 hours. So there's not a huge difference in geographical advantages. I think there is an hour difference. So, consider that maybe a wash. Louisville does have Johnell Davis. At least he's in the portal. But if one of the selling points that Louisville could use is saying, hey, look, we will, bring back Johnell if you decide to come here, you can play with your cousin. And maybe that is a selling point. Louisville having a ton of NIL. I mean, they're going to put it to the test. I think that the Cardinals could, get into a bidding war with almost anyone across the country. And getting a guy like Terrence Edwards, further proves that point. So, if Louisville makes an offer that you can't refuse, maybe that's where the surprise could come, is that it's just such an overpay of what maybe the Michigan side of things wants to pay, to where maybe then Johnell saying, well, it's such a huge monetary difference that I'm going to go to Louisville. That's really the only way that I could see this going in the Cardinals' favor. Nothing else really screams that Johnell would come to Louisville. I don't think it's likely at all. I would think that the percentages, in my opinion, this is straight intuition, it's probably 90% Michigan for a couple of different reasons. Number one, the familiarity with Dusty May. May is a player's coach. You're going to have an opportunity to make the tournament both at Michigan and at Louisville, and being able to play for a guy that knows your playing style that you played with before, it would be a seamless transition or pretty close to it. Just makes a ton of sense. And then there is something that social media caught on Thursday that if you had a lot of hope, it probably dwindled. Brandon Weatherspoon from Florida Atlantic sent out a tweet at 1:54 on Thursday saying, and I quote, "Made them slick comments about me early in the year, but now you're trying to recruit my teammates." Laughing face emoji, 100 emoji. "We're going to see how far you get with it. Hashtag good luck. Made them slick comments about me early in the year, but now you're trying to recruit my teammates." As petty as that may seem, it's still the reality. And if there is Florida Atlantic guys that are not fond of Pat Kelsey, well, it seems like that's closing the book, right? Because I think that there was the case to where, if I remember correctly, the situation that Weatherspoon is alluding to, I should say a better word, is when I think Weatherspoon made a comment to Kelsey that this is the viral clip where Kelsey wasn't happy. He went down to Dusty May and obviously was animate. And then Kelsey tweeted out, I think he said, "Hey, 23 from FAU, am I allowed to be on this court?" or something like that. Something along the lines. I'm paraphrasing here, obviously. But needless to say, seems like no love lost for Pat Kelsey from the FAU side of things. What makes this even more tough to swallow for Louisville fans that are holding out hope that the Cards might land Johnell Davis is that Johnell Davis actually liked Weatherspoon's tweet. So maybe Johnell looks past this. Maybe Pat Kelsey gets in contact with him and they have a conversation that might lead to Davis looking at Louisville as a possible option. Maybe the NIL is too good to pass up. Whole lot of maybes that I wouldn't really put too much stock into at the moment. I personally think Johnell is going to end up at Michigan if he doesn't stay in the NBA draft, which I guess is an opportunity that he might pursue. I would caution Louisville fans to, I'm not even really going to say be optimistic at this point. I'm going to say just see what happens. Don't get too high. Don't get too low. Just allow what happens to happen and see what happens. If it gets to a point where he makes a visit onto campus, maybe then you have a different viewpoint of things. But at this point, I really wouldn't hold our collective breath as a fan base. I feel like that alone right there, Johnell liking that comment that was made shows that maybe they don't view Pat Kelsey in the same light that Louisville fans do. Obviously, they played against Pat Kelsey. Maybe it's different if you're playing for Pat Kelsey. But again, even without that comment, I still think it's fairly unlikely. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. I know something not a lot of Louisville fans want to hear. Johnell Davis would change the trajectory of the ceiling of this team. He's a fantastic player, averaging 19 points per game, makes big shot after big shot. Fantastic player. So ultimately, it is what it is, and I think Louisville fans need to understand that this is a very steep uphill battle that the Cardinals are going to have to contend in. So there have been some great questions introduced to this week's weekly mailbag. We're going to answer those here in just a moment. Before we do that, I want to tell you a little bit more about our friends over at Amazon Fire TV. As I've told you, I have got a Fire TV stick that I plug into my TV, and it has been game-changing. It's not only giving me access to millions of movies and TV episodes, but also free and live TV. I'm a big baseball fan. Final Four's coming up, so this is my type of purchase. Fire TV also created the Fire TV channels to deliver a constant supply of the latest videos from your favorite sports brands, all for free. That includes all of us here at Locked On and most of the big pro leagues and college conferences as well. If you haven't checked out Fire TV channels, you should. Trust me on this. To learn more, visit www.amazon.com/LockedOnFireTV. Weekly mailbag segment time. There are a couple questions that I felt like it was good. We haven't had a mailbag this week. Unfortunately, I was not recording on Tuesday and Wednesday. I do apologize for the lack of content on those days, but wanted to get a mailbag segment in. We've had a couple of great questions both throughout the weekend and as late as today. There was a late submission to the mailbag. First question relates to the overall roster construction. With 3 commits in the fold for Louisville, how would you like to see Pat Kelsey, by the numbers, address the rest of the needs? That's a good question. They got a couple players from the College of Charleston, which I said 2 to 3 max. There haven't been any returning players. You got a big-name guy from James Madison, and then there's the opportunity to bring in some rotational guys that can learn for a couple seasons. With 3 players in, you need to get 10 more. I look for probably maybe 1 to 2 at most to be returning guys. So you're down to, let's say, 8. I think you're looking to bring in about 5 very solid rotational pieces, and that brings you to 3. And then, 3, if you want to go with developmental pieces, guys that can learn for a year and then be geared towards playing 2025, 2026. I would say at this point, you're looking to, in the remaining 10, go get, I'd say, 3 more guaranteed starters, guys that you could pencil in as starters. Maybe 1 to 2 returning guys. That would be 5. A couple rotational pieces, and then a couple of developmental pieces for the future. So it's really hard to tell. It depends on who you add, who would come back for Louisville. Sky Clark going to UCLA, Brandon Huntley Hatfield to NC State, 2 guys that I felt like we had a really good chance to bring back. Just didn't happen. So we'll see how that goes. Who would you believe would come back from this year's team, if any? Like I said, Sky and BHH have gone elsewhere. I think ultimately Tyler Johnson is not going to come back. Him entering the portal after Kelsey was hired is pretty much an indication of that. I think most likely I'd probably say Mike James, and then maybe Caleb Glenn, maybe JJ Traynor. I think if you made me pick of those 3, I'd say Mike James will be the most likely to come back, but who knows? We will see. I'm going to go with Mike James. The whole flight tracking situation was interesting. What are your thoughts on Dante Maddox Jr.? Is he a starting level guy? I think so. Dante Maddox from Toledo. For those who don't know, we talked about him on the most recent episode of the show, included Louisville in his top 8. Ty Spalding, he reported that Kelsey was in Toledo visiting Maddox, and some of his staff was in Chicago visiting his family. Louisville in his top 8, 55% around the rim, sharpshooter, crafty, pretty much a 40% three-point shooter, 22 three-pointers over 25 feet of distance, 94th percentile in spot-up situations, and he's a better passer than given credit for. So I think that, yes, Dante Maddox Jr., when you look at his top 8 with, Kansas, Illinois, and other schools of that matter in that caliber, it's pretty cut and dry as to how good of a player he is. Yes, I think that he would be a starting caliber player, and he would definitely change the ceiling of this year's team. Moving on along, it seems like football practices are going really well. I don't want to get too worked up over a couple of spring practices. Am I in the wrong for being as excited as I am? No, not at all. I think all of reports coming out of spring practice so far for Jeff Brom's team have been fairly positive. There have been some injury news, but for the guys that have been practicing have looked solid. A lot of the transfers will look good. I was told that this defense is legit. If they're able to put things together, that it's going to be extremely scary. Offensively, they have the pieces too. Tyler Shuck has had some great moments. We'll see, ultimately, is my response. I think that it's justifiable to be excited, but I wouldn't, like I said, don't get too high, don't get too low. It's still only April 4th. The spring game is still about 2 weeks away, and we need to get to a spot to where you are, getting into fall camp before you start to get that excited. So I think that it's justified to be excited, but I would just temper that excitement. The main question that, I got to ask this 4 times to include this in the mailbag. Haley Van Lith has entered the portal. Is there any way that she comes back? Never say never, I suppose, but I think that it is very, 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 very unlikely. Haley Van Lith opting to transfer out of LSU. I guess there's an opportunity for her to still return to Baton Rouge to play for Kim Mulkey, but she's a great player. I think that her decision to go to LSU, in hindsight, probably wasn't the best decision. She was the 4th or 5th best option at best, averaged 11 points per game, and had to play point guard for the majority of the year, whereas with Louisville, she was the leading scorer at 19. She was a fan favorite, and she was as successful with Louisville, probably more so than she was with LSU. She went to an Elite 8 and lost to Iowa after going to an Elite 8 and losing to Iowa. So I don't think that I don't think it's likely. I guess maybe it's possible if things can be reconciled, but I don't think that it wouldn't even surprise me if she's not even looking to make a return, because obviously it didn't seem like things ended well between both parties. I think for me, she might go out west. Stanford would ring a bell, maybe UCLA and USC. Personally, for me, my intuition is telling me she's going to join UConn and play with Paige Beckers and Azzi Fudd and Aaliyah Edwards and company, because of her relationship with Gino and with Paige and some other players on that team. I ultimately thought that that's where she was going to go when she left Louisville. She ended up going to LSU. So it would not surprise me to see her go to Stores to play with the Huskies. But that's going to wrap up the mailbag and the episode as a whole. Everyone have a great day. We'll see you right back here